Hey there! Tonight we're stepping into a Greek story that doesn't begin with thunder or triumph, but with quiet mornings, careful hands, and a life that changes so slowly it almost goes unnoticed. This is a tale about what happens when divine attention settles on an ordinary person, not as a blessing shouted from the heavens, but as a presence that lingers, warms, and quietly reshapes everything it touches. If these slow, ancient stories help you relax or drift toward rest, you're welcome to like the video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a gentle comment. Maybe just where you're listening from, or what time it is where you are, only if it feels peaceful. Now let the noise of the day soften and fade, settle into the stillness around you, and breathe slowly as we slip into a world where love from a God was never simple, and was often the most dangerous gift of all. In the quiet of a dawn that spread like spilled honey across the Cretan hills, a single dewdrop slid from a laurel leaf, tracing a path down the branch until it fell silently onto the upturned palm of a woman named Calliope. The drop rested there, unbroken, catching the first light in a prism of colours that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Calliope closed her fingers around it gently, feeling its cool weight, unaware that this was the initial touch of something vast and unyielding, a gaze from heights she could not yet comprehend. The air hung still as she rose from her kneeling position beside the stream, her linen chiton damp from the morning mist. She had come here to gather water, as she did each daybreak, but dipping her clay jug into the clear flow that murmured over smooth stones. The jug filled slowly, bubbles rising in lazy spirals, and she watched them without haste, her thoughts on the simple tasks awaiting her in the village below. Her steps back along the path were measured, each one pressing into the soft earth, leaving faint imprints that the sun would soon erase. The village awakened gradually, smoke curling from thatched roofs as hearths were kindled. Calliope passed the home of her neighbour, old Theron, who sat carving a wooden flute by his doorway, his knife moving in steady strokes against the grain. Their eyes met, and he nodded, his face creased with the familiarity of shared years. But there was a subtle shift in the light that morning, a golden hue that lingered longer than usual, warming the stones underfoot. Calliope felt it on her skin, a gentle pressure like an unseen hand, but she attributed it to the rising sun and continued on. Entering her modest dwelling, she found her mother, Irene, tending the small garden behind the house, pulling weeds with fingers gnarled from decades of labour. Irene looked up as Calliope set the jug on the stone table, her eyes reflecting the same quiet strength that had sustained their family through lean harvests. They worked together in silence, preparing the morning meal, grinding spelt into flour, mixing it with water from the jug, shaping it into flat loaves baked on the hot hearthstones. The scent filled the room, earthy and comforting, a ritual that bound them to the land and each other. As they ate, sitting on woven mats by the window, the light outside grew brighter, casting long rays that danced across the floor like fingers reaching inward. Calliope paused mid-bite, her gaze drawn to the laurel sprig she had picked by the stream and placed in a shallow bowl. Its leaves shimmered unnaturally, as if polished by invisible breath. Irene noticed her daughter's distraction, but said nothing, only passed her a piece of honeycomb, the sweetness a small indulgence saved for such mornings. The day progressed with deliberate calm. Calliope ventured to the meadow where the family's goats grazed, herding them with soft calls and a slender staff. The animals moved lazily, nibbling at the wild thyme that dotted the hillside, their bells tinkling in a sporadic melody. She sat on a flat rock under a solitary oak, watching clouds drift across the azure sky, her mind wandering to songs her father had taught her before the sea claimed him. Without thinking, she hummed one now, a low melody of waves and longing, her voice carrying faintly on the breeze. By midday, the sun stood high, its heat pressing down like a benevolent weight. A traveller appeared on the distant path, his form silhouetted against the light, carrying a lyre slung across his back. He approached slowly, his steps unhurried, and stopped at the meadow's edge. "Your song calls to the winds," he said, voice resonant, like the echo of a distant harp. Calliope looked up, her eyes meeting his, eyes that held the depth of endless skies, golden, flecked, and unblinking. She felt a pull then, subtle yet insistent, as if threads had been woven around her heart, without her notice. The traveller sat nearby, not too close, plucking idly at his lyre strings. Notes floated into the air, weaving with the goat's bells, creating a harmony that seemed to still the world. Calliope listened, her staff forgotten in her lap. The melody stirring something deep within, memories not her own, visions of sunlit temples and eternal flames. When he finished, he offered her a single golden apple from his pouch, its skin flawless, radiating a faint warmth. A gift from the groves above, he murmured, placing it in her hand. She took it, fingers brushing his, feeling a spark that lingered like embers under ash. As evening approached, Calliope returned home. The apple tucked in her chiton fold, its weight a constant reminder. Irene greeted her at the door, helping to pen the goats, their movements synchronized from years of shared duty. They prepared the evening offering together, pouring olive oil into a shallow dish, whispering thanks to Demeter for the day's sustenance. The flame from the small lamp flickered as they spoke, shadows lengthening across the walls like watchful sentinels. Calliope did not mention the traveller. Instead, she placed the apple on the household altar, its glow subtle in the dim light. Night fell softly, stars emerging one by one in the velvet sky. Calliope lay on her pallet, the apple scent drifting through the room, sweet and intoxicating. She dreamed of golden light enveloping her, lifting her above the hills, showing her futures unwritten. She awoke before dawn, heart pounding, to find the apple unchanged on the altar, but a faint golden residue on her palms, as if she had held the sun itself. The following days blurred into a pattern laced with subtle change. Calliope returned to the stream each morning, but now the water seemed clearer, the dew drops heavier on the leaves. She gathered them carefully, letting them pool in her hands before drinking, feeling a vitality that coursed through her veins. Villagers noticed her glow, a luminosity to her skin, a grace in her step, but attributed it to youth and good fortune. Old Theron carved her a small amulet from olive wood, pressing it into her hand with a knowing smile, though he said nothing of why. As the moon waxed, the traveller reappeared, this time at the stream's edge. He carried no lyre, only his presence, which filled the grove like midday sun. "I am called by many names," he said quietly, "but to you, I am light." Calliope stood still, jug in hand, water dripping slowly from its rim. He touched her shoulder lightly, and visions flooded her, prophecies of bountiful harvests, of storms averted, of glories yet to come. She gasped, the jug slipping from her grasp, shattering on the stones. He caught the fragments mid-air, reassembling them with a gesture. The clay whole again, filled anew. They walked the path together that morning, his steps matching hers, though his stride could span mountains. He spoke of eternal things, music that bound the stars, poetry that shaped fates, his words wrapping around her like warm silk. At the village edge, he vanished into the light, leaving her with a laurel wreath woven from branches that did not grow on earthly trees. She wore it home, its leaves evergreen, whispering faintly in the windless air. Irene saw the wreath and paused in her weaving. Shuttle halted mid, pass. No questions passed between them, only a shared glance heavy with unspoken understanding. That night, as they performed the bedtime rites, extinguishing lamps, securing shutters, Calliope felt the wreath's weight settle deeper, a crown not of honour, but of binding. Weeks passed, the divine visits growing more frequent, each one leaving a mark. A song etched in her memory, a vision that lingered behind her eyes, a touch that warmed her through the cooling nights. Villagers began to whisper, first in awe, then with a tinge of envy. Crops in her family's field flourished unnaturally. Goats gave milk richer than before. Yet with each gift came a subtle cost, dreams that stole sleep, prophecies that hinted at shadows amid the light. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold, Calliope climbed the hill alone, the wreath still upon her brow. She stood before the ancient oak, palm pressed to its bark, feeling the pulse of something greater. "What do you ask of me?" she whispered, not to the tree, but to the light that gathered at the horizon. No answer came, only the slow descent of dusk, but to wrapping her in a mantle of quiet inevitability, where love and ruin began to intertwine like roots beneath the soil. Months slipped past like water through open fingers, each one carrying the same quiet rhythm that had once felt safe. Calliope rose with the first pale light, walked the familiar path to the stream, filled the jug with deliberate slowness. The clay vessel now bore faint golden veins, where cracks had once appeared, marks left by the traveller's touch when he had mended it without effort. She no longer noticed them consciously. They had become part of the object, like the weight of the laurel wreath, that still rested lightly on her brow each morning before she removed it to work. The village moved around her in widening circles. Neighbours still greeted her, still bartered olives for spelt, but conversations grew shorter when she approached. Women at the communal oven lowered their voices as she passed. Eyes flicking toward the evergreen leaves, she sometimes wore braided into her hair. Old Theron continued carving beside his doorway, but his knife moved more slowly now. as though measuring each stroke against an unseen scale. One afternoon he called her over, held out a small wooden bird he had finished. "For the window sill," he said, placing it in her palm. The bird's wings were spread, frozen in mid-flight. Calliope thanked him quietly and carried it home, setting it beside the household altar, where the golden apple still sat, untouched since the day it was given. Irene watched the changes without comment. She tended the garden with the same steady hands, pulling weeds that seemed to wither faster near the rose Calliope had once watered. The vegetables grew larger, brighter. Tomatoes heavy on the vine, cucumbers thick and cool, but their taste carried a faint metallic edge, as though sunlight had been poured too generously. Mother and daughter ate in silence most evenings, chewing slowly, tasting both abundance and something unspoken beneath it. After the meal, Irene would rise, sweep the hearth, bank the coals low. Calliope helped without hurry, their movements mirroring each other like shadows cast by the same flame. The divine visits came without warning, always at moments when the world felt stillest. One dawn he appeared beside the stream before she had even dipped the jug. No footsteps announced him. The light simply thickened, gathered shape. He stood barefoot on the moss, golden hair catching the first rays, eyes holding the same endless depth. He did not speak at first. Instead he reached down, lifted a single pebble from the stream, and placed it in her hand. The stone was warm, smooth, radiating a faint pulse like a second heartbeat. "Keep this," he said softly. "It remembers the river's song." Then he was gone, leaving only the pebble and the scent of sun, warmed myrtle. Calliope carried the stone in the fold of her chiton all day. It grew heavier as the hours passed, not in weight but in presence. By evening, when she placed it beside the apple and the wooden bird on the altar, that the pebble had cooled, yet its surface still shimmered as though wet from the stream. Irene glanced at it once, said nothing, only lit the evening lamp with a steadier hand than usual. Dreams began to arrive more often. Not nightmares. Nothing so violent, but visions that lingered long after waking. She saw herself standing on a cliff above the sea, a wind tearing at her garments. Below her, a city of white marble, rising tier upon tier toward a temple roofed in gold. Voices sang in languages she had never learned, yet she understood every word. Prophecies of harvests that never failed, of children born under auspicious stars, of poets whose lines would outlast empires. In every vision the same figure stood behind her, not touching, only present, his breath warm against her neck, his light wrapping her like a second skin. She woke each time with salt on her lips, as though she had tasted the sea. Irene would already be stirring the hearth, pretending not to notice the tremor in her daughter's hands. As she poured water for the morning ablution, they performed the daily rites together, pouring libations of milk into the earth, whispering thanks to Hestia for the roof above them. Yet the words felt heavier now, as though spoken into a space that listened too closely. One midday, as Calliope carried water back from the stream, the sky darkened without warning. Clouds gathered in moments, thick and bruised, coloured, though no wind stirred the leaves. She quickened her pace, jug balanced on her shoulder, sandals slipping on the suddenly damp path. Lightning forked silently across the heavens. Thunder followed long seconds later, rolling like distant drums. By the time she reached the village edge, rain fell in heavy drops that stung her skin. She sought shelter beneath the ancient oak at the meadow's border. The tree's branches arched above her, leaves shivering as water cascaded from them in silver sheets. She pressed her back to the trunk, jug set at her feet, and waited. The storm intensified, wind now whipping through the grove, bending the olive branches almost to breaking. Yet no fear rose in her chest. Instead, a strange calm settled, as though the tempest recognized her. He appeared then, stepping from the rain, as though it parted for him alone. Water streamed from his shoulders, but did not touch his skin. His chiton remained dry, golden, edged, glowing faintly against the grey. He stood before her without haste, eyes holding hers through the downpour. "You called the storm," he said, voice carrying clear above the wind. Not with words, with longing. Calliope shook her head once, slowly. "I only wish for shelter." He smiled, a small, knowing curve of the lips. Shelter is never simple when the sky answers. He extended his hand. Raindrops hung suspended around his fingers, trembling but not falling. Calliope looked at the offered palm, then at the jug at her feet, then back to his face. She did not take his hand. Instead, she lifted the jug, balanced it on her shoulder again, and stepped out from under the oak into the full force of the rain. The storm broke as suddenly as it had come. Clouds parted, sunlight poured through in long shafts, turning every raindrop into a prism. The path steamed, the air smelled of wet earth and ozone. Calliope walked home drenched, chiton clinging to her skin, hair plastered dark against her neck. Yet she moved without hurry, each step deliberate, as though measuring the distance between what had been offered and what she still chose to carry alone. Irene met her at the doorway with a dry blanket. She wrapped it around her daughter's shoulders, without question, led her inside, stoked the hearth until warmth filled the room. They sat together by the fire, Calliope's teeth chattering faintly, the blanket slowly steaming. Irene passed her a cup of barley water, warmed with honey. Neither spoke of the storm, of the figure in the rain, of the hand left unclasped. That night, as the house settled into quiet, Calliope lay awake listening to the drip of water from the eaves. The pebble from the stream rested on the small table beside her pallet. Its surface caught stray firelight and held it, a tiny golden eye in the dark. She reached out, closed her fingers around it. The stone was warm again, pulsing faintly in time with her heartbeat. Outside, the moon rose full and silver, bathing the village in light that felt both gentle and unyielding. Somewhere far above the hills, a single note sounded, high, clear like the first pluck of a lyre string. It lingered in the air long after it should have faded, a reminder that attention once given was never fully withdrawn. Spring arrived without fanfare, the hills greening slowly under a sun that seemed to linger longer each day. Calliope walked the paths with the same measured steps, though now the earth felt warmer beneath her feet, as though it remembered the light that had once passed through her hands. The laurel wreath she no longer wore daily. Instead, she kept it folded in a cedar chest beside her pallet, its leaves still fresh, still whispering faintly when the lid was lifted. The garden behind the house bloomed earlier than any other in the village. Roses climbed the low wall in profusion, their petals deep crimson, almost black at the edges. Irene tended them carefully, pruning with small bronze shears, collecting fallen blooms in a shallow basket. She never spoke of their unnatural vigour. She simply placed a single flower each morning on the household altar, beside the golden apple, the pebble, the wooden bird. The scent filled the room, sweet, heavy, carrying a note of something metallic beneath the perfume. Villagers began to come quietly. First, a woman whose child had been feverish for weeks brought a small clay figurine of a dove and set it at the gate without entering. The next day the child walked again. Then a farmer whose olives had failed 3 seasons, running left a jar of new, pressed oil on the doorstep. When he returned the following autumn, his trees bore fruit so heavily the branches bent to the ground. No one named the gifts. No one asked questions. They simply left offerings and departed, footsteps soft on the path. Calliope noticed the circle widening. Children who once ran past her gate now paused to watch her draw water from the well, their eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. One girl, no older than 8, approached one afternoon holding a handful of wild poppies. She extended them without a word. Calliope knelt, accepted the flowers, pressed them briefly to her cheek. The girl smiled once, small and fleeting, then ran back toward the village. That evening Irene prepared the meal in silence. Barley porridge thickened with goat's milk, drizzled with honey from a comb, left anonymously at the door the week before. They ate by the open window, watching the light fade across the hills. After, Irene rose, swept the hearth, then paused at the cedar chest. She lifted the laurel wreath, held it a moment, then placed it gently on Calliope's head. The leaves settled without rustling. Mother and daughter looked at each other across the small room. No words passed. Only the quiet acknowledgement that what had begun could no longer be set aside. Dreams grew more vivid. Calliope saw herself standing in a meadow of endless asphodel, golden light pouring from above, yet the flowers beneath her feet turned slowly to ash. She walked through them anyway, barefoot, but feeling the crunch of charred petals, the heat rising through her soles. In every dream, the same figure waited at the far edge, silent, radiant, never approaching, never retreating. She woke each time with the taste of ash on her tongue, yet her skin glowed brighter, as though the light had seeped inward and could not be expelled. One midday, she climbed the hill to the ancient oak alone. The tree stood unchanged, bark rough under her palm. She pressed her forehead to it, closed her eyes, listened to the slow creak of wood bending in the windless air. A single leaf detached above her, spiraled downward, landed on her shoulder. She did not brush it away. Instead, she sat beneath the branches until the sun stood directly overhead, shadows shrinking to nothing around her feet. When she descended, the village lay quiet below. Smoke rose thin and straight from chimneys. A dog barked once in the distance, then fell silent. Calliope paused at the stream's edge, knelt, let the water run over her hands until they numbed. The pebble from the stream rested in her palm. She had carried it every day since it was given. Now she set it on a flat stone beside the flow, watched the current swirl around it without moving it. The stone gleamed wetly in the sunlight, a small golden heart in the clear water. She rose slowly. Jug balanced once more on her shoulder and walked home. The path felt longer than it ever had, each step carrying the weight of eyes she could no longer see. Eyes that watched from heights too distant to name, yet close enough to feel their warmth like sunlight on skin. At the doorway Irene waited, hands folded, face calm. She took the jug without comment, carried it inside. Calliope followed, removed the wreath, laid it carefully on the chest. Outside, the first evening star appeared above the ridge, bright against the deepening blue. The air held still, expectant, as though waiting for the next note in a song that had only just begun. Summer settled over the hills like a heavy golden cloth, the air thick with the scent of ripening figs, and sun, baked thyme. Calliope moved through the long days with the same deliberate care, though now each task carried an added layer of stillness. She drew water at dawn when the world was quietest, letting the jug fill drop by drop, listening to the soft plink of liquid against clay. The stream ran clearer than ever, small fish darting in silver flashes beneath the surface, as though the water itself had been polished. The offerings at the gate multiplied quietly. A woven basket of bread one morning, still warm, a small amphora of wine the next, sealed with wax that bore no mark. Calliope accepted each without ceremony, carrying them inside to share with Irene. They ate the bread slowly, tasting the faint sweetness of honey someone had kneaded into the dough. They poured the wine into shallow cups, sipped without toasting, letting the silence between swallows speak what words could not. Irene's hands began to tremble faintly when she worked the loom. The shuttle moved slower, threads occasionally slipping from her grasp. Calliope took her place without being asked, sitting at the bench, but feet working the pedals in steady rhythm. The cloth she wove was plain linen, undyed, yet under her fingers the warp and weft seemed to catch light differently. Subtle shifts of gold threading through the white, visible only when the sun struck at certain angles. She did not remark on it. She simply continued, letting the pattern emerge as it would. One afternoon, the sky held perfectly still, no breeze to stir the leaves. Calliope walked to the meadow alone, staff in hand, goats trailing behind in a loose herd. She sat beneath the oak, back against the trunk, and closed her eyes. The heat pressed down, drawing sweat along her temples, yet she felt no discomfort, only a deep, encompassing warmth that seemed to rise from within. She opened her eyes to find him seated across from her, cross-legged on the grass, golden light pooling around his form like spilled honey. He held no lyre, no apple, no pebble, only himself. "You have carried what I gave," he said, voice low, resonant. "Now carry what follows." Calliope met his gaze without flinching. "What follows?" He reached forward slowly, palm up. In the centre of his hand lay a single feather, long, white, edged with gold. It did not move in the windless air. It simply rested there, weightless yet solid. A token, he murmured, from wings that never tire. She did not take it at once. She studied the feather, the way light travelled along its barbs, refracting into tiny rainbows. Then she lifted it carefully between thumb and forefinger. It felt cool against her skin, yet sent warmth travelling up her arm, settling behind her breastbone like a second heart. She tucked it into the fold of her chiton, beside the pebble she still carried daily. He rose without sound, stepped closer. For the first time he touched her face, fingertips brushing her cheek, light as a falling leaf. Visions flooded her again. Cities rising in marble splendour, songs spreading across seas, children born with eyes the colour of storm, lit skies. Yet woven through every image ran thin dark threads. Storms that shattered fleets, songs that drove listeners mad, children who grew too quickly and too bright, burning out before their time. She drew back slightly. His hand fell away. "All gifts carry shadow," he said quietly. "Even mine." Calliope stood. The goats had gathered at a distance, watching with wide, unblinking eyes. She turned toward the path home, feather still pressed against her skin. He did not follow, only watched her go, his form gradually dissolving into the heat haze that shimmered above the meadow. That evening she placed the feather beside the other tokens on the altar. Irene lit the lamp without looking directly at it. They sat together by the hearth, firelight playing across their faces. Calliope reached for her mother's hand, their fingers interlaced, steady despite the faint tremor in Irene's grip. Outside, the first cicadas began their evening song, slow, rising, falling. A rhythm that matched the pulse she now felt beneath her ribs, steady and unhurried, yet deeper than her own. The night deepened. Stars emerged above the ridge, bright and cold. Somewhere in the distance a night bird called once, then fell silent, leaving only the weight of what had been given and the quiet question of what it would demand next. Autumn came with a slow turning of the leaves, first at the tips of the olive branches, gold bleeding inward until the groves looked brushed with fire. Calliope walked among them each morning, gathering fallen fruit into a wide basket, her steps deliberate despite the growing heaviness in her limbs. The olives were larger this year, skins glossy, oil richer when pressed. Yet the first pressing carried a faint bitterness that lingered on the tongue long after swallowing. Irene moved more slowly now, rising later, resting longer by the hearth. She no longer worked the loom. Instead, she sat on the stone bench outside, hands folded in her lap, watching the light shift across the garden. The roses still bloomed, though their petals dropped faster, carpeting the ground in deep crimson. Calliope gathered them daily, pressing them between wax tablets, stacking the dried blooms in a cedar box beside the altar. Each flower held the same metallic sweetness, a reminder of abundance paid for in ways neither mother nor daughter named aloud. The village offerings continued, though fewer now. A small clay lamp appeared one dawn, its wick already trimmed, a handful of almonds the next, still in their green husks. Calliope carried each inside without haste, placing them beside the growing collection, on the altar, golden apple, warm pebble, weightless feather, wooden bird, dried roses. The space had become crowded, yet nothing touched another, Each token rested in its own quiet orbit, as though held apart by invisible threads. Dreams arrived nightly now, no longer separated by weeks of respite. Calliope saw herself standing on a marble terrace above a city that stretched to the horizon, temples gleaming, streets filled with people who moved in slow, graceful patterns. Music rose from below, lyres and flutes weaving melodies that pulled at her chest. Yet every face turned upward toward her carried the same expression, or edged with fear. In the distance, the same radiant figure watched, never closer, never farther, light pouring from him in steady waves that both illuminated and blinded. She woke each time with tears drying on her cheeks, though she could not remember weeping. Irene would already be awake, stirring barley water over the coals, pretending not to notice the dampness on her daughter's face. They performed the morning rites together, pouring milk into the earth, whispering thanks to Hestia, yet the words sounded thinner now, spoken into a space that absorbed rather than echoed. One midday Calliope climbed the hill to the ancient oak alone. The tree's branches arched wider than she remembered. Leaves rustling softly, though no wind moved the air. She sat beneath it, back against the trunk, closed her eyes. The feather rested against her skin beneath her chiton, cool and steady, its presence a constant pressure behind her breastbone. She felt the pulse there, her own heartbeat entwined with something larger, slower, eternal. When she opened her eyes, he stood before her, not seated this time, only present. Sunlight poured around him, yet cast no shadow on the grass. "You have carried the tokens," he said, voice low, resonant. "Now carry the name." Calliope looked up slowly. What name? He extended his hand again. In the centre of his palm lay a single word written in light. Letters that shifted and reformed, never quite settling into one shape. She could not read it, yet she understood it completely. A name that meant both beginning and ending, gift and debt, love and ruin. She did not reach for it. Instead she stood, brushed leaves from her chiton, met his gaze without lowering her eyes. "I already carry enough," she said quietly. For the first time something flickered across his face. Not anger, not sorrow, only a brief dimming of the endless light. "All who are touched carry more than they choose," he murmured. "The name is not given to be refused, it is given to be born." He stepped closer. The air warmed, thickened, scented with myrtle and distant sea. Calliope felt the words settle against her tongue without being spoken, silent, heavy, tasting of honey and ash. It did not leave when he withdrew his hand. It remained lodged beneath her ribs, pulsing in time with the feather, with the pebble, with every token she had accepted. He faded then, dissolving into the light that poured through the oak leaves. Calliope stood alone beneath the tree, breathing slowly, feeling the name move inside her like a second breath. She descended the hill as the sun began its long slide toward the horizon. The path felt steeper, each step carrying the added weight of what now lived within her. At the house, Irene waited on the bench, hands folded, face calm. She did not ask where Calliope had been. She simply rose, took her daughter's hand, led her inside. They sat together by the hearth as evening fell. Calliope placed no new token on the altar that night. Instead, she rested her palm against her chest, feeling the quiet thrum beneath her skin. Irene watched without speaking, then reached for the cedar box of dried roses. She selected one, crumbled its petals into the fire. The flames flared briefly, gold-edged, then steadied. Outside, the first stars appeared above the ridge, bright and unblinking. Somewhere in the distance, a lyre string sounded once. High, clear, lingering, a note that carried both promise and warning. Fading slowly into the night air that now held the weight of a name unspoken yet fully known. Winter arrived with thin, pale light that barely warmed the stones. Frost silvered the olive leaves each morning, melting slowly as the sun climbed. Calliope rose earlier now, breath clouding in the cold room, and kindled the hearth with careful hands. She fed the small flame twigs gathered the day before, watching it catch and steady until warmth spread across the floor in slow waves. Irene remained on her pallet longer, wrapped in the heaviest wool blanket, eyes half, closed against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The garden slept beneath a thin crust of ice. Roses that had bloomed so fiercely now stood brittle, petals curled inward like closed fists. Calliope walked among them once each day, brushing frost from the stems with her fingertips, until they glistened wetly in the weak sunlight. She did not prune. She simply touched, letting the plants know they were still seen. The offerings at the gate had dwindled to almost nothing. A single dried fig one morning, a sprig of rosemary the next. But she carried each inside with the same quiet reverence, but placing them beside the crowded altar, where the tokens lay untouched, gleaming faintly in the firelight. The name that had settled inside her no longer felt foreign. It moved with her breathing, a low hum beneath every heartbeat, rising sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn to fill her chest, until she could taste honey and ash on her tongue again. She spoke it only once, alone by the stream at first light, the words slipping out soft as mist. The water rippled outward in perfect circles, though no stone had been dropped. She watched the rings expand and fade, then knelt, let the cold current run over her hands until feeling left her fingers. When she rose, the name had sunk deeper, no longer a visitor, but part of the rhythm of her blood. Dreams no longer came as separate visions. They bled into waking hours. She would pause mid-task, grinding grain, sweeping the floor, and see marble terraces, golden cities, faces turned upward in awe and dread. The images arrived without warning, clear as reflections in still water, then dissolved just as quickly, leaving only the afterimage of light behind her eyes. Irene noticed the moments when Calliope's hands stilled, gaze distant. She never asked what her daughter saw. Instead, she rose slowly, took the pestle or broom, continued the motion herself until Calliope returned to the present. Their hands brushed in these exchanges, warmth passing between them like a shared secret. One afternoon, snow fell, rare. Soft flakes that drifted through the still air and settled on every surface without melting. Calliope stepped outside, arms open, letting the cold touch her skin. The flakes caught in her hair, on her lashes, melting slowly against the unnatural warmth that now lived beneath. She walked to the ancient oak on the hill, footsteps leaving faint prints in the white. Beneath the tree she sat, back to the trunk, and closed her eyes. Snow continued to fall, blanketing her shoulders, her lap, yet she felt no cold, only the steady thrum of the name, the feather's quiet pressure, the pebble's faint pulse against her chest, where she now carried all the tokens close to her skin. He appeared without sound, standing a few paces away, light pouring around him in soft gold that melted the snow in a perfect circle at his feet. Grass showed green beneath, untouched by frost. He looked at her, not with demand, not with pity, only with the endless patience of something that had watched seasons turn for millennia. "You have borne the name," he said, a voice carrying clear through the falling white. "Now bear what it calls." Calliope opened her eyes. Snowflakes clung to her lashes. She blinked them away slowly. "What does it call?" He did not answer with words. Instead, he lifted his hand, palm up. Light gathered there, coalescing into a small, perfect sphere, no larger than an apple, yet containing within it the flicker of entire cities, the rise and fall of songs, the brief bright lives of those who would one day sing her name. The sphere hovered, turning slowly, each rotation revealing new glimpses, poets reciting lines that echoed across seas, children with storm, grey eyes dancing beneath olive trees, temples roofed in gold that caught every dawn. Then darker flickers, fleets shattered by sudden gales, voices silenced mid-verse, children growing too swiftly and fading before their time. The sphere held both without preference, light and shadow woven so tightly they could not be separated. Calliope watched without reaching. The snow continued to fall around them, soft and unceasing. After a long silence she spoke, voice low, steady. "I will carry what must be carried," she said. "But I will not become the storm that breaks them." The sphere dimmed slightly, as though listening. He lowered his hand. It dissolved into motes of light that drifted upward, mingling with the snow until both were indistinguishable. "You already are both," he murmured. "Gift and cost. Light and ruin. The name ensures it." He stepped back, form thinning into the white, until only his eyes remained, golden, unblinking, then gone. Calliope sat alone beneath the oak, snow piling higher around her, yet the warmth within kept her untouched. She rose slowly, brushed flakes from her chiton, and walked home through the quiet fall. Irene waited at the doorway, blanket around her shoulders. She said nothing as Calliope entered, only took her cold hands between her own warmer ones and held them until feeling returned. They sat together by the hearth that night, firelight steady, the name humming softly beneath Calliope's ribs like a second, slower heartbeat. Outside, the snow continued through the dark hours, blanketing the village, the hills, the ancient oak, covering every trace until morning would reveal a world made new, yet carrying beneath its surface the same quiet, inevitable weight. Years turned upon the hills like slow seasons in a dream that refused to end. The olive groves thickened, branches heavier with fruit each harvest, though the oil pressed from them carried that same faint metallic edge, sweetness shadowed by something unnameable. Calliope walked the paths with steps that had grown careful, her joints remembering every winter frost. Yet her presence still drew the eye skin that caught light too readily, hair that gleamed even in thin winter sun, eyes holding depths that made younger villagers look away first. The house stood smaller in the landscape now, walls receiving fresh whitewash every spring, though the brushstrokes grew shorter each year. Irene had slipped away one quiet winter night 3 seasons earlier, breathing slowing until it stopped, face calm, as though listening to a distant song. Calliope had washed her alone, wrapped her in the length of linen she herself had woven years before, the one with threads of gold that appeared only in certain light, then carried her to the small plot beneath the ancient oak. No large procession followed. Only a handful of neighbours stood at a respectful distance, while Calliope placed the last handful of earth, pressed it flat, then sat beside the new mound until dusk settled and the first stars appeared above the ridge. She returned to the house alone that night, lit the hearth with the same deliberate care, sat by the fire until the coals dimmed to ash. The altar remained unchanged: golden apple, warm pebble, weightless feather, wooden bird, dried roses, and now a small clay figurine of a seated woman, Irene's last gift, left on the bench the morning before she died. Calliope touched each token once before sleeping, fingertips lingering longest on the figurine. The name within her had grown quieter over time, not gone, only deeper, like a river carving its bed through stone. It rose sometimes in the stillness between tasks, when she ground grain at dawn, when she swept the floor at dusk, when she sat beneath the oak watching light move across the grass. With each rise came glimpses, not full visions now, but fragments, a line of poetry recited in a distant agora, a child's laughter echoing through marble halls, a ship's sail torn by sudden wind. The fragments arrived without demand, left without farewell, leaving only the aftertaste of honey and salt. Villagers no longer left offerings at the gate. Instead they came openly, women bringing daughters to learn the old weaving patterns, men asking which day the moon would favour planting, children carrying flowers or smooth stones found by the stream. Calliope received each without ceremony. She showed the girls how to tension the warp, how to let the shuttle pass without forcing the thread. She told the men to watch the wind at dawn, to listen for the first cicada before sowing. She accepted the children's stones and placed them beside the others on the altar, until they spilled gently onto the surrounding table. One spring a young poet arrived, barely past his first beard, lyre slung across his back, eyes bright with questions carried across 3 islands. He hesitated at the doorway until Calliope gestured him inside. They sat by the hearth as he spoke of songs that came to him in dreams, melodies he could not yet shape into words. She listened, then rose, took the feather from the altar, and placed it in his palm. "Sing what you hear," she said. "Do not ask where it comes from." Light moved briefly along the feather's golden edge, then stilled. He left before dawn. Years later word reached the village of verses recited in Athens that made listeners weep without knowing why. Lines of love that lifted and destroyed, of light that burned as fiercely as it warmed. Calliope never asked if the feather returned. She continued tending the garden, pressing oil, sitting beneath the oak when the light was right. The pomegranate tree she had never planted now stood tall by the gate, roots spreading beneath the path. Each autumn she gathered fallen fruit, split the skins, let the seeds spill onto stone. But birds carried some away, ants took others. A few took root in distant corners, small green points rising without fanfare. One evening she climbed the hill alone. The ancient oak waited, bark deep, grooved, branches wide. She sat beneath it, closed her eyes. The name stirred, soft now. No visions came. Only a certainty what had been given had passed through her. Changed shape, entered the world in fragments too small to trace yet too persistent to vanish. When the first star appeared, village lights flickered on below, steady, unhurried. Smoke rose thin and straight. Somewhere a lyre sounded, a single clear note held long enough to cross the valley. Calliope rose and walked home through the dark. The house waited, lamp lit, hearth bamped low but steady. She sat beside the altar, hand on her chest, feeling one heartbeat now, slower, deeper, carrying everything that had come before and everything yet to follow. Outside, the pomegranate fruit hung heavy, waiting for the next hand that would split, taste, and carry forward what could never be refused, only born. Decades folded into the hill's quiet rhythm. Olive trees she had tended as a girl now stood ancient, trunks thick, branches heavy with darker, sweeter fruit. She no longer climbed the ladder. Younger hands brought her baskets of oil each autumn. Its faint metallic trace, honey-edged with iron, had become simply the taste of the land. The house softened with time. Walls leaned inward. The thatch was renewed by careful hands. The altar remained, though fewer tokens crowded it now. The golden apple dulled to bronze. The pebble stayed cool, the feathers gold frayed to silver. The wooden bird held its spread wings, the roses crumbled to dust. Only the small clay figure of Irene remained untouched, as if time had passed it by. Calliope moved through days with the economy of someone who had nothing left to prove. She rose before light, kindled the hearth, swept the floor. She walked to the stream with a small jug left at her gate long ago, but filling it drop by drop as the current carried leaves and flecks of sunlight downstream, without hurry. Children came often now, not with offerings, but with questions. They sat beneath the pomegranate's arching branches, while she spoke of simple things. When to plant barley so roots would grow deep, how cloth learned its shape, why the first olive must be poured back to the earth. They asked nothing of the light that sometimes gathered in her eyes, nothing of the name beneath her ribs. They listened and carried her answers home like small treasures. One spring a girl no older than 10 arrived, carrying a single laurel leaf she had found on the hill. It was fresh, evergreen, though no laurel grew wild nearby. She held it out without speaking. Calliope accepted it, turned it slowly between her fingers, felt the faint pulse that still lived in its veins. She pressed the leaf between the pages of an old scroll, one of the few possessions she had kept, and returned the scroll to the cedar chest. The girl watched the motion, then asked, very quietly, "Will you teach me to weave like you?" Calliope looked at her, really looked, and saw the same steady curiosity that had once lived in her own childhood eyes. She nodded once, From that day the girl came every afternoon, sitting at the loom, while Calliope guided her hands over the shuttle, showing her how to let the thread breathe rather than force it. The cloth they made together was plain at first, then slowly gained faint golden threads, not woven indeliberately, but appearing where the light struck just so. The girl never asked where the gold came from. She simply continued, learning the rhythm of pause and pull, silence and motion. Years passed in that quiet way. The pomegranate tree bore fruit so heavily some seasons that branches snapped under the weight. Calliope gathered what she could reach, split the skins, scattered seeds along the garden edges. New saplings rose in corners no one had planted, their leaves glossy, their fruit tart and bright. Birds carried more seeds farther. Soon small groves appeared on neighbouring hills, their presence accepted without remark. One autumn evening, as the sun sank in a slow tide of amber, Calliope climbed the hill to the ancient oak for the last time. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one placed with the care of someone measuring a final distance. The tree waited, but branches wider than memory, bark grooved deep enough to hold shadows even at noon. She sat beneath it, back against the trunk, closed her eyes. The name within her stirred, soft now, almost tender, no longer a weight, but a companion that had walked every path beside her. No visions came. No radiant figure appeared. Only the slow creak of wood bending in the windless air, the distant murmur of the village settling into evening, the faint rustle of leaves overhead. She felt the heartbeat beneath her ribs slow, matching the tree's deeper pulse, matching the earth's long, patient rhythm. When she opened her eyes, the first star had risen above the ridge, bright against deepening blue. She rose slowly, brushed leaves from her chiton, and walked home through the gathering dusk. The house waited, lamp glowing softly in the window, hearth fire banked low but steady. She crossed the threshold, closed the door behind her without haste, and sat on the bench beside the altar. Her hand rested on her chest. The thrum beneath her skin had grown very quiet, still present, still hers, yet ready to be carried elsewhere. She touched each token once more, fingertips lingering longest on Irene's figurine. Then she leaned back, eyes on the small flame that danced without wavering. Outside, the pomegranate tree stood motionless, heavy with the last unharvested fruit. One orb detached, rolled gently down a branch, fell to the path with a soft thud, and split open. Seeds spilled across the stones, red, glistening, catching starlight like scattered embers. Inside, the lamp burned clear. Calliope's breathing slowed, matched the fire's gentle rise and fall, then eased into stillness. The name within her did not depart. It simply settled deeper, no longer bound to one heartbeat, but ready to move through the hands that would touch the loom next, through the voices that would sing the old melodies, but through the roots that would carry pomegranate seeds, farther than any single life could reach. The flame held steady a moment longer, then dimmed to a soft glow. Outside, the village lights flickered on one by one, steady, unhurried. Somewhere in the distance a single note sounded, high, clear, like the last pluck of a lyre string before silence claims the melody. And the hills kept watch, patient as they had always been, while what had once been a dangerous gift passed quietly into continuance, light and shadow, blessing and cost, woven so tightly now that no hand could ever separate them again. Good night.